Okay, Salam. This is going to be a continuation of our last chapter, uh, chapter 8, Historical Narratives of a Jewish Presence in Sub-Saharan Africa, from mythical realities to historical metaphors. And we are continuing from possible references to Hebrew Semitic traces in Southeast Africa. So let's begin. Traditions built around the biblical story of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba have frequently been invoked to explain the history of Southern Africa. According to the Bible, the wealth of Solomon was acquired through a trading venture he undertook with Hiram, the king of Phoenicia. We already know that the idea that Solomon acquired golden wealth from Africa contributed to the notion that Ophir, the land of biblical gold, was located at the tip of Africa. The legends of the maritime undertakings of Solomon and the Phoenicians established links between the Semitic world and East Africa, which played a decisive role in determining how Europeans viewed Southeast Africa. The idea that all African achievements were the product of outside Hamitic influence was widely propagated by several European explorers and colonial officials. The monumental stone structures of Great Zimbabwe haunted British imaginations, which simply refused to believe that this achievement could be the work of black Africans. Early European discoverers of Great Zimbabwe proposed a wide variety of external origins for the building of this magnificent construction. The favorite theory was that the builders of this impressive city had been Phoenician, and that the monuments were connected with the biblical tales of Solomon's gold mines and the Queen of Sheba. When J.T. Bent carried out the first excavations in 1891, damaging large parts of the site in the process, and thus making the job of later archaeologists extremely difficult, the objects uncovered suggested to him tenuous comparisons and parallels with Assyria, Cyprus, Egypt, and Arabia. As Garlake comments about Bent, he approached the problem of Great Zimbabwe firmly believing, like almost everyone else, that its origins must lie with a civilized ancient people who must therefore necessarily have come from outside Africa. It is the claim of Jewishness of the Lemba people of Southern Africa, intriguing in historical terms, that recently revived an issue that was dependent on myths and legends or diffusionism. The Lemba are a black Southern African Bantu-speaking group of 50,000 to 70,000 people who live in the southern, central, and eastern parts of Zimbabwe and in northeast South Africa. According to oral history, the Lemba came from Judea, Egypt, Yemen, or Ethiopia. Professor M.E.R. Mativa, the late president of the Lemba Cultural Association, suggested that the Jewish ancestors of the Lemba migrated as traders in the 7th century BC from the north of Yemen, where they established a community in Sena. The Jewish community of Sena or Basena was supposedly expanded by Jews who escaped the Babylonian exile in 586 BC and traded with Phoenician merchants in the Orient and Africa. From Sena, they crossed into Africa through the indefinable Pusela, moving down the coast, building great cities in Zimbabwe until finally settling the northern part of South Africa. Additionally, the Lemba assert Jewish identity through their customs of circumcision, food prohibitions, and ritual slaughter of animals. The tradition of an origin outside Africa differs from clan to clan, but all those who have observed them agree that they have undergone Hebrew Jewish influences, and that in the past they had contact with Muslims. British colonists who had a political interest in dismissing the role of black populations in the building of Great Zimbabwe considered the Lemba as descending from the Jewish builders of the Stone City. In 1967, Ger, who had been the editor of the racist journal The Mankind Quarterly in Bulawayo, Zimbabwe, affirmed that the Lemba's history can specifically be traced back to the pre-Islamic Sheba of Yemen, who was converted to Judaism. In his book, The Origin of the Great Zimbabwe Civilization, 1972, he further argued that the Lemba have Jewish cultural and genetic traits that can only have been acquired from Judaized Sabians who settled in the region thousands of years ago. The probability against coincidence is so great that we have to accept the fact that the Lembas observed the Mosaic Code, and that we have to explain its occurrence among this small tribe of traders who have the Caucasoid genes and live in northern Transvaal and some adjacent parts of Rhodesia. Moreover, only the Lemba bleed animals to death, as enjoined by the Mosaic Code, and this act is restricted to the circumcised. A recent survey carried out by A. Ruatar, the senior curator of ethnography at the Museum of Human Sciences in Harare in Zimbabwe, rejected this hypothesis of an extra-African origin of the Lemba, considering it was the product of invention by outsiders. According to Parfit, however, there are cogent grounds for considering that the Lemba's ancestors came from southern Arabia, perhaps the city of Senna in Hadramaut, which had a tradition of migrations to Africa. Parfit suggests that later on, the history of the Lemba might have been linked to the Islamization of the eastern coast of Africa, particularly the civilization of the city referred to by medieval Arabian geographers as Sayuna, where religious syncretism was practiced and accepted. Upon arrival of the Portuguese in the 16th century, the Lemba might have turned away from Islamic influence and developing their own religious and identity system, in particular by conserving the practice of endogamy and dietary taboos that still characterize them today. This is what certain indirect sources lead us to imagine. Jews have been living in the Arabian Peninsula for centuries before the time of Muhammad. Peace be upon him. Hypotheses and speculations about the dates and circumstances surrounding their arrival date their presence to biblical times. Jewish settlers, probably established in the oasis communities of northern Arabia around the last part of the Second Temple period, were found in considerable numbers in Arabia. They were well integrated into the life and culture of the peninsula, where they practiced caravan trade, date cultivation, and craft making. These Jews who spoke Arabic were organized into clans and tribes, and although they probably constituted a relatively small percentage of the population, their influence was strong in pagan Yemen. We know that the fertile oasis of Yathrib in Arabia had been settled by Jews organized in tribes who constituted the majority of the population and probably gave its name to Al-Madinah, that is Medina. When Muhammad peace be upon them, came to Medina, they were forced to sell their properties and leave that area. What became of them afterwards is not at all clear. Jewish influence in the Arabian pre-Islamic period was significant enough to play an important role in classical Arabic historiography. A chain of traditions of a legendary nature, together with interpretations of epigraphy, gave rise to the not implausible hypothesis of a mass conversion to Judaism in the Himyarite kingdom, southern Arabia, until its conquest by the Ethiopians in 525. Duhnuwas, king of Himyar, was allegedly converted to Judaism by his father Abu Kariba, circa AD 385 to 420 to 385. Abu Kariba himself had converted earlier under the influence of some Jews who assisted him in a campaign against Persia and some Arabian provinces of Byzantium. According to these traditions, Duhnuwas, the last of the Himyarite kings, became a devoted Jew whose zeal alienated Christian merchants. A neighboring king, Adug, defeated Duhnuwas, who retaliated by attacking another Christian city, Nadran. He besieged the city, giving the inhabitants the alternative of accepting Judaism or dying, following which 20,000 of them chose death. An Abyssinian army defeated Duhnuwas, who died jumping into the sea with his horse. Even if these traditions admittedly have a legendary character, there are some reasons to believe that the legend of the conversion of the Himyarite kingdom to Judaism is founded on some historical elements, which it is. The anonymous work of the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea from the 1st century AD provides information on a very early pre-Islamic Arab influence in East Africa. The Periplus records that the Sabians, pre-Islamic Arabian Yemenites, were one of the great Semitic powers in ancient times and were involved in all settlement and exploitation of the coasts of East Africa, where they exchanged spears, axes, knives, and glassware for ivory and tortoiseshell. In the search for Senna, the mythic city of the Lemba, a further important source of information is constituted about the accounts of Arab historians and traders. In fact, a number of unreliable traditions attempt to give a precise historical framework for the arrival of the Arabs on the coast of on the east coast of Africa. One such tradition claims it is well known that in the year 696, the two princes of Oman, Suleiman and Said, were attacked by the forces of the Caliph Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan of Damascus and forced to flee to the land of Zanj in East Africa. There we also find the tradition of the coming of the Arabs who settled along the coast, and the name of their chief, who was Haji Said. In AD 943, the Arab historian Abu al-Hasan al-Musuli wrote that Muslims of Arabia sailed on the Indian Ocean as far south as Madagascar and to Sofala in the lands of the Wak people. According to Al-Adresi, in the 10th century, Sayuna was a town connected to the land of Sofala and peopled by groups of Indians and Zanj and others. In the 13th century, another Arab writer, Hassan ibn Sa'id, who was also a philosopher and historian, described Sayuna as the capital of the kingdom of Sofala. It has been supposed that the fabulous Sayuna of the Arab geographers was indeed the center on the Zambesi. While it is interesting to recall that the name Sayuna is very similar to the normative Arabic word for Zion and identical to the Judeo-Arabic, the form of Arabic used by the Jews, there is no proof other than the obvious similarities of names. Some sort of a non-African population was again referred to in the 14th century by Ahmad ibn Majid, the Arab pilot who showed Vasco da Gama the way from the Sofala region to India. He mentioned that the population around Sofala included men of the Egyptian Nile. The Portuguese historian João de Barros de Barros, writing in the 16th century, refers to the arrival of heretical Muslims who moved into the interior in the 8th or 9th century. He called them Emozaji, which may be an attempt to formulate the Arabic Umma Zaidiyya, the Zaidi nation, referring to followers of the Shiite pretender to the throne, Sayyid ibn Ali, who was killed in 739. The Lemba ancestor Sayyid is referred to by most of the observers who have described the tribe, and he may conceivably have a connection with the Barroses Emozaiji. But in any case, there is no proof of this. However, Sayyid is a common Arab name, and the presence of this name in the Lemba tradition is strongly suggested of an Arab influence. Upon their arrival, the Portuguese described the inhabitants of Sofala and those of the settlement at Zena on Zambesi as Moors. According to Antonio de Saldanha in 1511, there were some 10,000 Moors living in the Sofala hinterland, DN Beach. There were some 10,000 Moors living in the Sofala hinterland. D.N. Beach, the author of A History of the Shona, notes that Portuguese documents of the 18th century frequently referred to Mauros who traded in the country, and that this term was often translated by Arabs or Swahili. In fact, to the Portuguese of that period, Moro simply meant Muslim, of whatever color or language, who could be distinguished by a Muslim name, a turban, and some degree of Islamic religion. Duarte Barbarossa, writing in the 16th century, noted, "These Moors of Sofala are black men, some olive-skinned, who use the tongue of the land, which is that of the Gentiles. They speak some Arabic." Beach comments, "It seems highly probable that the Muslims of the plateau, some 5 centuries after East African trade began to reach it, were simply Islamicized Shona. It is of course possible that Swahili and even Arabs did visit the plateau, but there is no definite proof of it. Dos Santos adds that further inland, these lands are inhabited by heathen Kafir and Moors, some black, some white, some of whom are rich. Also, they are the subjects of the Monomotapa. They live there almost independently, being at a great distance of the court of the king. 20th century oral traditions reveal that these same areas were inhabited by a red-skinned race of traders known as Amwenye Vashava. Ahmad ibn Majid also refers to these people and mentions that the area around Sofala belonged to the people of Muna Musavi, which is probably the singular form of Amwenye Vashava. According to Parfit, These people were no doubt the ancestors of the Mwenye, or the Lemba of today. The name Vashava is preserved in the tribal praise name Musavi or Mushavi, and its meaning can be explained from the Bantu root meaning to trade, while Mwenye evokes feudal lord or master. The Portuguese expedition under Antonio Barreto ended the political power of the Moors of the Sofala region, and Muslim traffic up to the Zambesi came to an end. As Parfit wrote, those non-Bantu elements in the Sofala Sena hinterland never made any attempt, as far as we know, to contact the strong Muslim community to the north, nor did they acquire or reacquire the Quran. As the Lemba so often maintained, their book was lost. There are various indications that in the first half of the 14th century, the Mwenye occupied the northern part of present-day Zimbabwe. There is also substantial evidence that these Mwenye were present at the court of the Monomotapa, and that they formed a political entity. A report from African named Mahumane provides more information about them and tells us that from the beginning of the 18th century to the second half of the 19th, political and cultural changes came from outside. The Walembers, Lemba, who are always coming here with those in the well, are a nation who lives on top of the country of Inthawel, and they are a nation which some years ago got the worst of a struggle from those from Gaul, and then part of them went under the protection of the Inthawelers, while the other part submitted to the victor. The aforementioned Walembers was said to be rich in gold too, and this nation was also doing trade with the Portuguese in the direction of the aforementioned Sena and Manica. All traces of these putative Lemba's ancestors were lost thereafter. They probably integrated into other groups where they filled the roles of goldsmiths, iron and copper workers, medicine men, and ritual experts. These few hypotheses suggest that since ancient times, there could have been links between southern Arabia and the southeast coast of Africa, including Madagascar. Possible references to Jewish and Semitic migrations in Madagascar. In respect to one or more Jewish colonies in ancient Madagascar, the subject has been much debated due to the accounts of Etienne de Flacourt, the French governor of Fort Dauphin. Flacourt, who spent the year 1652 in Madagascar, reported the discovery of remnants of an ancient Jewish colony on the eastern coast of Madagascar, on the island of Sainte Marie and in Fenerive, or whatever. Fenerive. The peoples who I think were the earliest to come to Madagascar were the Zafre Ibrahim or Abraham lineage, who lived on the island of Sainte Marie and neighboring lands. All the more so since although they practice circumcision, they have no mark of Mohammedism. Know neither Mohammed nor his caliphs, peace be upon them, and consider their followers as kafres and men without law. They do not eat or conclude any alliance with them. They celebrate and do not work on Saturday and not on Friday like the Moors, and have no names similar to the ones they have. This leads me to think that their ancestors visited this island during the earliest migrations of the Jews, or that they descend from the most ancient Ishmaelite families as early as before the captivity of Babylon, or from those who could have remained in Egypt after Israel left the country. They have maintained the names of Moses, Isaac, Joseph, and Noah. even if there are here women and children much wider than the Matatanes and having hair as straight as them. Following off Lacourt and referring frequently to his account, subsequent observers such as the Captain de Valgny identified an ancient background of ideas among some Malagasy populations, particularly the belief in only one God who cannot be represented by an image, which invokes a similarity with the Jewish pre-Solomonic civilization. Another suggestion of a possible Jewish Hebrew presence in Southeast Africa comes from Alfred Grandidier, the most important and influential authority on Madagascar of all times. Grandidier dedicated his life to filling the 52 volumes of his encyclopedic Histoire physique naturelle et politique de Madagascar, 1901, and is considered the ultimate authority on this subject. About an ancient Semitic migration to Madagascar, Grandidier wrote, the fleet sent by King Solomon toward the southeast coast of Africa had probably some of their ships lost on the coast of Madagascar. And it is not unlikely that in ancient times, some Jewish colonies had been founded, voluntarily or not, in this island known from the Comoros. Grandidier listed 35 traits common to all Malagasy and ancient Jews. His considerations are largely inspired by an Arab text written in Mayotte, quoted by Gevry, that relates the history of the Comoros Islands and reveals that in times of Solomon ben Daudu, Solomon, son of David, Arabs or Idumean coming from the Red Sea with their wives, children, and slaves settled in Negazidia, Great Comoro, and after that many men from Africa and the Zanzibar coast came to inhabit these islands. Grandidier inspired numerous collaborators, and disciples such as Keene, who would write in The Gold of Ophir, 1901, about the ancient links between Palestine and Madagascar. That people who preserve many Israelitish rites, usages, and traditions cherish the memory of Abraham, but have no knowledge of any of the prophets after the time of David, which implies that the Jewish immigrants left their home at a very remote date. Documents are quoted to show that the Comoros, a stopping point between Madagascar and Rhodesia, were peopled during the reign of Solomon by Arabs, or rather by Idumean Jews from the Red Sea. As explained herein above, elsewhere in Africa, borrowings from the myth of the lost tribes included in the interpretive movement of the earliest colonial enterprise contributed to the construction of the origin of the Malagasy by foreigners. In the 19th century, some missionaries of the London Missionary Society believed that all of the Malagasy religious antecedents derived from the Hebrew religion itself, and that all Malagasy were supposed to be descendants of Jews who came to Madagascar in Fawn ships. Malagasy origins have long been the subject of much academic dispute, which is still only partially resolved. There was a consensus among modern scholars that navigators from Indonesia settled along the coast of East Africa acquired some Bantu vocabulary, and then sailed to Madagascar already speaking a language that contains a mixture of Bantu words. In fact, ancient accounts attest to the trading or migratory movements of Phoenicians, Chinese, Indians, Malays, Persians, Arabs, and Jews along the coast of southern Arabia, eastern Africa, and the Indian subcontinent. Any of these people could have reached Madagascar in outriggers, dhows, junks, or any kind of seafaring craft with the help of wind and currents. Maritime contacts do not allow for any automatic inference of any significant contribution to the peopling of Madagascar. However, it can be postulated that many migrations into Madagascar took place. Therefore, the presence of Idumean colonies or Arab Jews from Yemen in Madagascar may be considered. As explained earlier, since very ancient times, Yemenite Arabs have gone as far as Sofala on the eastern coast of Africa, and the Comoros archipelago was visited by their boats. We know that Arabs traded down the eastern coast of Africa. In this context, Arab is a convenient name covering various groups affected to a greater or lesser extent by Islam. Originating in most cases in Arabia, but who could have spent several generations in East Africa or elsewhere en route to Madagascar. Local chronicles from the main islands of the eastern coast of Africa, as well as accounts of the great sea travels undertaken by the Portuguese in the 16th century, enable us to follow the major Arab and Persian migrations that could have reached Eastern Africa. Comoros and Madagascar. Immigration of some groups belonging to minority religious sects and suffering persecution after the expansion of Islam in Arabia, Persia, and Egypt probably took place. Grandier considered that the earliest Arab colons in Madagascar could have been Ziadites, some of them having left the Sawad of Kafwa after having failed in their revolt against Caliph Hisham in 737, and the others after having overthrown the Umayyad Caliph Walid, had to leave Arabia according to Masudi's record in the accounts of Barros and How dos Santos. The evidential value of these hypotheses is discussed adequately by Gabriel Ferrand, an important Arabist and student of Muslim communities in Asia, Africa, and Madagascar, in Les Migrations Musulmanes, Les Migrations Musulmanes et Juives a Madagascar, 1905. The study of an undated manuscript which refers to a caliph who reigned in the 13th century leads Ferran to consider that the Islamicized Malagasy descended from Sunnite Muslims. Ferran discovered in a khutbah, a special Friday prayer, that Islamized Malagasy recited in Madagascar, mention of the ultimate Abbasid Caliph of Baghdad, Al-Motasim, who reigned from 1242 to 1258. The title of Prince of the Believers given to the Caliph in the Khutbah shows that the Islamicized Malagasy and their descendants still prayed for the one who was the ruler of their ancestors. Ferrand also cited a text whose author is thought to be a member of the Orthodox Shiite sect or Imamites, and he envisaged that the Persian Shiites could have migrated to the eastern coast of Madagascar between 800 and 818, while acknowledging that the discrepancy of information does not make it possible to clearly determine the date and origin of the earliest Arab arrivals on the island. A Portuguese record of the Jesuit priest Luis Mariano, who visited the southeastern coast of Madagascar in 1613, evoked the hypothesis of a Muslim migration prior to the 13th century. According to the words that Father Mariano recorded from King Andrian Ansiambani, the king himself, they originated from Mangalore and Mecca, where his ancestors were born. These ones who had embarked on one or several ships got lost, and from the coast of India ran onto the coast of the north tip of the Madagascar island. Little by little, they multiplied and came as far as the south tip. This had happened many years earlier. In one branch there had been 17 generations, and in one 14. Thus, on the eastern coast of Madagascar, people of this family are scattered. Father Mariano observed that the customs they kept were a testimony of their origin, that they were Moors, and that they called themselves Solimas, a derivation in modern Malagasy of Silamu Islam, while pointing out that they have the same color as Indians, Arabs, and Javanese. Father Mariano added that they have a Quran written in Arabic, observe Ramadan, do not eat pork, and practice circumcision. The first Arab ancestors are generally known in Madagascar as Antal al-Otra, or people from across the sea. It is likely that the first Arabs crossed the Mozambique Channel were some of the pre-Islamic traders who had been pushed out of Arabia or Africa. They could have been members of one of the sects that broke away from the Orthodox Mohammedan faith during the turbulent times of Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his immediate successors, or Jews who had converted to Islam. Sometime in the 8th or 9th century, the boats reached the Malagasy coast, probably from the Comoros, and they set up trading posts along the northwest coast from where they expanded. Elsewhere on the island, particularly along the east coast, there are numerous traces of Arab or Islamic cultural influence, but no knowledge of the central features of the Muslim religion. The name Allah, the mosque, prayers, or the pilgrimage to Mecca, where the name of Muhammad, peace be upon him, is distantly remembered. He represents one prophet among others rather than the prophet, what would seem to indicate that the Arabs from whom the Antal-Loatra descended were pre-Islamic. The combined evidence from archaeology, oral traditions, and written 16th century Portuguese accounts reveals that the early Muslim traders had two important settlements on the western coasts of Madagascar. Archaeological excavations on the northeastern site of Vohemar, known by its ancient name of Iharana, had yielded an entire culture complex based on external commerce and dominated by traders who wrote in Arabic since at least the 12th century. A subsequent group was the Zafiramenia, descendants of Ramini, who probably arrived early in the 14th century, and who, according to the traditions, come from Mecca or from Ramni, which was the medieval name for Sumatra, sometime after Islam had established itself in Indonesia in the 13th century. The ancestors of the Antemoro arrived some two centuries after the Zafir Menia, around the end of the 15th century. There are some major interest as possessors of important historical manuscripts. The Sorabe, great writings or sacred books, probably originally written in Arabic, but adapted at an early stage to the Malagasy language. The Sorabe are concerned with astrology, geomancy, divination, and medicine, the knowledge of which gave the possessors great prestige throughout Madagascar. If there are historical records of major interest, the reliability of the Sorabe is uncertain because most of them appear to have been written relatively recently and copied with varying degrees of accuracy from older documents. Even if the Sorabe do not really help us to be precise about the origins of the Antemoro, like the Zafira Minia, with whom their traditions are often confused, they claim noble descent from Mecca and mention sometime a stay in Africa on the way to Madagascar. Another hypothesis of the origin of the Antemoro was recently suggested by Brown. It has been recently argued very plausibly that the origin of both the name and the people is to be found in the Somali country of southeastern Ethiopia, where there was a tribe called Temur, which disappeared from the area in the 15th century, which coincides with the date of the arrival of the Antemoro in Madagascar. Such a trace has been found by Enrico Cerulli in Ethiopia's epic song Negus Yeshak, which refers to a vanished people named Temur in connection with the Somali. Therefore, it is not impossible to consider that the original ancestors of the Antemoro came from Arabia to the Somali area, which was traditionally a home for heretics and dissenters who were subsequently driven out by the expansion of the Gala people. The Islamic faith of the Antemoro, who practice both tribal and clan endogamy, seems to have declined rapidly, and little trace remains apart from a special taboo on eating pork, funerary rituals, and sacrifices. It was mainly through the Antemoro that words borrowed from Arabic were absorbed into the Malagasy language, notably the days of the week and terms associated with astrology, arithmetic, and divination. The Antemoro carried a priestly prestige deriving from their magical arts, which enabled them to provide ambiasi, priest doctors, and diviners, mipi sikiti, to the ruling clans in their own regions, as well as to many other tribes. One might deduce that the Antemoro immigrants, like the Antalaotra in general, were predominantly male and married local Malagasy women. If the Antemoro genealogical traditions allow for some reasonable speculation with respect to an initial Arab settlement, the Portuguese chronicles are more precise. In 1507 to 1508, a Portuguese captain, Rui Pereira, mentioned a possible colony of Moors at Matitana, a place inhabited by the Antemoro, and reported that the local inhabitants were no stranger to the external trade, having brought silver and beeswax to his ship. Tristão de Cunha, admiral of the Portuguese fleet in the Western Indian Ocean, was able to find in Mozambique a Moor named Bogima who had previously been to Matitana. In 1513, Lisbon sent Luis Figueira to establish a small fort and ginger processing factory in Matitana. Luis Figuera wrote that by that time, Matitana was a town densely inhabited by Moors. It is therefore possible to say that Moors on the African mainland knew about the region of Maitana and traded occasionally with it before the Portuguese discovery of Madagascar in 1506. Specific links with Africa can be found on the tombs of Sokoambe on the western coast, where bird carvings appear on rectangular tombstones. Only the tombs of Sokoambe in Madagascar have bird effigies that are remarkably similar to soapstone carvings of birds found in Great Zimbabwe. According to Dos Santos, 1609, the term Sakumbe was related to the kingdom of Sakumbe on the Zambezi River at a point marked by a cataract that impeded navigation. While this link with Great Zimbabwe could be questioned, it coincides with numerous local traditions of a Malagasy dynasty in this area, the Maroseranya or Valomena, which appeared in the mid-16th century. This dynasty is considered by several traditions as formed by the marriage of new immigrants, described as white men, with the daughters of local chiefs. The Maroseranya later took over leadership of the Sakalava society, and the first Sakalava conqueror was called Adrianda Hifatsi, which means Prince White Man. Throughout Madagascar, Grandier observed that nearly all the chiefs and rulers were of a different origin from the mass of people, as attested by words of their mother tongue. As an expression of the Hamitic myth, it has been generally accepted that an Arab or Indonesian origin might explain the legend of early white chiefs, but recently it has been argued that the founder of the Masoseranya came from Black Africa, more specifically the Zimbabwe Empire around the Zambezi. An African origin has also been suggested for the names of other early Maroseranya kings, particularly Andrea Manda Zaola, whose name translates as Crusher of Trees, which was one of the titles of Mwene Mutapa, the great Zimbabwe king. One Sakalava tradition is that the precursors of the Maroseranya landed on the southwest coast of the island with a shipload of gold, which they used to gain supremacy over the local people. The alternative name of the Maroseranya, Volamena, means golden in Malagasy, while Maroseranya itself may be derived from Mari, which was the word for gold in Zimbabwe. If it is difficult to believe that Africans from Zimbabwe could be described as white, there is a possible explanation that would attribute a Zimbabwe origin of the dynasties with white men tradition. In the late Middle Ages, the Zimbabwe gold may have been taken over by the Arabs. Nineteenth 19th century travelers to Venderland and Mashonaland had cited the local tradition that white men had once inhabited the interior. In 25 Years in a Wagon in the Gold Regions of Africa, 1887, Andrew Anderson wrote, "The natives state that the gold was worked and the forts built by white men that once occupied this country, whom they call Aberlamba. It is therefore imaginable that the ancestors of the Maroseranya were Arabs who could have landed in the southwest coast with a shipload of gold, and that they set up kingdoms of their own based on the model of the Zimbabwe Empire. This hypothesis coincides with Murdoch's opinion, which considers that a Venda-Zimbabwe link can be postulated for the Antinosi society inhabiting the southeast part of the island and who claim an Islamic descent. Murdoch suggests interesting parallels between the Antanasi and the Venda incorporated Lemba, who possess markedly Semitic physical features as well as cultural traits that distinguish them sharply from their neighbors. It seems that the Zimbabwe complex accounts for much African influence in Madagascar can suggest that the Shona-like pottery discovered in southeastern Madagascar, dated circa 1100 AD, may be the indication of a terminal human migration of people or peoples familiar with some features of the Zimbabwe culture. Much later, no doubt, links between Old Rhodesia and Madagascar proved to be both familiar and useful to the gold-bearing Proto-Maroserania. Sarana. One can establish a parallel between these hypotheses and the opinion of Wilmot, who states that Moguedchao, Mozambique, was founded about 930 years after Christ, and there seems little doubt that the political establishment of Arabs of Sofala can be shown to have taken place about 1100 AD. In fact, during the supposed period of Iharana settlement, most of the evidence thus suggests that the origin of some of the Malagasy dynasty could be connected with the Arab world through Africa since ancient times. The White King myth, as well as the notion that dynastic change in Madagascar was imposed by a foreign culture, can be explained by repeated waves of Moorish migrations to the Great Island. While questionable, there are some interesting analogies between the Lemba of Venda in Zimbabwe and the Malagasy group descending from the Antaloatra, particularly with respect to the prestige conferred by divination and medicine, which differentiates them from their neighbors, and the tradition of their being white men. A small group of Onjatsi to the north of Vohemar, which claims an Arab origin, has a reputation of Ombiasi and Mpitsikidi that strikingly recalls the characteristic activities of the Lemba, such as tradition and the earliest observers recorded them. As discussed earlier, Parfit suggested that the Arab traders of the Sofala hinterland, known as Amwenye Vashava, could possibly be the ancestors of the Mwenye, or the present-day Lemba. There are various indications that the red-skinned Mwenye traders occupied the northern part of today's Zimbabwe around the 14th century. There is also substantial evidence that these Mwenye were present at the court of Monomotapa and that they formed a political entity. In advancing connections between Madagascar and Zimbabwe, it is possible to imagine that the original ancestors of the Antaloatra could be these Mwenye Arabs who could have come from Zimbabwe to Madagascar. This hypothesis suggests that the Antamoro and the Lemba, who both reveal substantial Arabian Islamic influences, could share a common Semitic substratum. They both could have subsequently developed the basis of a characteristic identity and religious system during which they have lost the instructions of the Quran, but maintain certain traditions. However, this hypothesis which suggests connection between some Malagasy ruling clans and the Lemba calls for further research and can nowhere substantiate any single origin or monolithic theory of the Malagasy past. Most of the evidence thus suggests that the past of such groups as the Lemba in southern Africa or the Antomoro descendants in Madagascar is connected with the Arab world. But there are also suggestions that earlier immigrants from Yemen could have been associated with the aforementioned Muslim followers of Sayyid ibn Ali, constituting together the Moorish people, a kind of Judaic Arabic people described by historians and missionaries. Since pre-Islamic times, Arab Hebrews or Judaized Arab merchants could have migrated to the shores of Africa for trade, and then, after the arrival of the Prophet, for religious, political, or economical reasons. Thus, a Sabian or Yemenite involvement and influence in Southeast Africa might have been possible. This seems to be confirmed by the recent genetic investigations carried out on the Lemba, discussed later, which suggests an extra-African origin without entirely allowing us to distinguish between Jewish and Arab Semitic ancestry. Genetic research on the notions of origins, ancestry, and identity has, during recent decades, become interlaced with history, popular discourses, and myths. Genetic archaeology, the study of the detailed structure of DNA, is being used to gain a better understanding of the relationships between populations, separated by distance and time, and to enhance the knowledge of history not enlightened by documentary evidence. The way in which genetics has been perceived by African Americans, Native Americans, Jews, or other communities concerned by historical genetic research about their identity is part of a mythical reconstruction of history. The case of the Lemba is one of the most frequently cited because genetic investigations were an essential step in